I think being quietly romantic is one of the most activist things you can do to recreate and recultivate what you understand Romanticism to be away from the modern sense of it. And I think those things come from fairy tales, they come from folk songs, they come from genuinely noticing and experiencing joy of service to nature is quietly romantic to nature. It's being in relationship with it and being in service to it. So yeah, I think I try as much as I possibly can to really cultivate a quiet romanticism with nature.
Brontie Ansell, welcome to the Accidental Gods podcast. How are you and where are you on this kind of grey January morning?
Hi. So I'm good. I'm feeling particularly like we're moving into quite a different phase now. So I feel like the old 2025 is finally shedding, and I think we're sort of galloping towards a new space. So yeah, it feels really positive in some ways. For me, I know that's not the same for everybody, but my world is all feeling really great.
Brilliant.
Where am I?
Where are you?
I'm
Yes.
in the northern hemisphere in a place where the trees are still very brown and spiky, but the crocuses are out, the daffodils are out. Yeah, there's a few buds, few shoots of growth. So it feels like spring is literally knocking at the door for me. So yeah, that's me.
You must be quite a ways south of us because our snowdrops only just come up. I can
Oh,
see the
really?
daffodils are thinking about it, but we certainly haven't seen a crocus yet. Anyway, you're
Yeah,
right.
we're in the south here, so
Right, right. And the nights are getting slightly shorter. Used to be when the puppy got me up, it was still very, very dark, and now I can almost go downstairs without a torch. So this is good. Anyway, you're one of the co-founders of Lawyers for Nature, which says, amongst many other things, we imagine a world in which nature has legal rights and we act as though it does. And yet, we're recording on the Monday after Alex Pretty was shot on the streets of Minneapolis. And last night, Elliot Morris of Strength in Numbers, which I do not think is a particularly hardcore left-wing organisation, far from it, said of the United States, the consent of the governed has been withdrawn, which I think is what you were referring to a little in terms of 2025 felt like everybody was gearing up for something, and 2026 has seen the something begin to unleash. And I'm well aware that in the majority South and Iraq and Venezuela and lots of the Middle East, particularly Gaza, the consent of the governed was withdrawn a long time ago. But it hasn't been withdrawn in the US probably since what we call the War of Independence and they call the Revolutionary War. And so we're in a point where law, who decides what's legal, feels to me, is becoming really relevant again. And there was one of the definitions of fascism, which is, let me get this right, there's an in-group that is protected but not constrained and an out-group that is constrained but not protected. And that following that definition of authoritarianism, the people at the top decide which laws apply to them and which laws apply to everybody else. And that we're in that territory now. And as a lawyer, I wonder how that feels for you.
yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot. I think the stories we tell ourselves are really, really fascinating. I get completely obsessed with the stories we tell ourselves. And I think what's becoming really apparent to most people is that law is just a story. It really is just another story. And
Right.
I think we've been in this incredibly privileged position for a good many decades whereby most people understand law to be statutory. So
Mhm.
people petition their MP, and that MP takes a proposition to the government supports the legislation goes through, the legislation exists, there's no retrospective aspect to that legislation, and everybody knows the law, and now we have a new law, and off we go, right? And
In an
I
ideal
think
world. Has that
Yeah.
worked like that for a while?
I think, well, I think that has been people's understanding of law. Even with the stuff around the European Union, people did understand that the European Union largely made law through process, right? Um, but I think what's becoming really apparent with the points that you've just made is that law starts way before that. I mean, law starts as morality, it starts as ethics. It really does start as a story around a campfire. You know, shall we behave like this? Shall we say that? Shall we treat things like this? Shall we treat people like that? Um, and sometimes that takes a very long time to work its way through to the legislative system. And other times it's almost instantaneous, where there's a flip and the social contract is broken and completely ripped up and destroyed, right? And we are scrabbling around saying, what on earth has just happened? Um, and I think that when we think about law as a story that some humans tell other humans, we do really quickly realize how fluid it is, and how important the storyteller is in that, the amount of power they hold, um, the options for constraining that power, the options for sharing that power. And so we I think there's only been honest conversations about power in some circles, right? You know, the vast majority of people just, they understand that power exists, but they don't necessarily critically examine it, who's holding it, how they're constrained, until something really awful or radical or destructive or terrible happens. And they say, well, how did that happen? And then you have to explain, well, the power wasn't constrained in the ways we thought it was, or the constraints weren't strong enough, or they weren't diverse enough, or they weren't diffused across a number of structures enough. And so, yeah, constitutional power is absolutely fascinating. And I think it's the spaces in between that we never watch. And that fascinates me as well. It's the stuff of the ether. It's the swirling dust in between the big hard rocks. And that's so fascinating, because we can look at constitutional structures and we can go, well, they can't do that and they can't do that, but then they do all this stuff in between. And you just go, wow, what, when, you know? And it's because there's those gaps and they can be exploited. And of course, sometimes they can just ride roughshod over the hard corners as well, you know. So
Well, exactly. I mean, it seems to me, particularly in the US, but also with Boris Johnson in the UK, that they just decided that certain laws did not apply to them. And I think
right.
there's a particular class of people, particularly in the UK, the public school boys, and I use that gender very explicitly, who have always believed that the law did not apply to them in any way. And then they get into power, and what's different now is that they're not masking it anymore. The masks have come off. And as many, many people have been explaining over the weekend, it has always been thus for the not white, not men. Throughout our trauma culture, it's just that it's becoming more obvious, and it's now that the in-group is narrowing very fast. The people that they will defend but not constrain is basically now straight white men. And not even that. I mean, straight white men who agree with their politics. So there were lots of the right wing over the weekend saying that basically anybody who disagrees with the current administration in the US is a domestic terrorist and therefore is fair game. Without going into that in huge detail, what I'd like to explore, I really resonate with this idea that our world is the stories we tell ourselves and each other about ourselves and each other. And that we often don't examine them because we're kind of skating across the top of a shared unreality and a shared sort of agreement, and we don't explore the depths of that agreement too deeply until it begins to fall apart. So, for instance, I'm watching a lot of people online exploring the Second Amendment in rather more detail than they were previously, because Alex was carrying a gun that he did not touch and that had been removed from him before he was shot. But the fact that he carried it suddenly, for certain aspects of the political body in the US, is evidence of terrorism, when previously it was evidence. Carl Rittenhouse turns up an underage boy with an automatic rifle that he could not have been licensed to have, and that's his Second Amendment right, because he was shooting at black people. I think the hypocrisy is more obvious. And I also really think of David Allen Green, who up until now has been the constitutional lawyer in the UK to whom I pay most attention, who says, he's quoting one of his lectures that he never names, but he says his name is on the spine of all the books that will be in a legal library. And he said, domestic law is a matter of record. Foreign law is a matter of expert opinion. And international law is largely a fiction. Which we have seen also recently with Trump just, international law is what he says it is or not what he says it is. Greenland is or is not an independent nation, depending on whichever strange wave of geriatric insanity has passed across his brain most recently. And yet we're also discovering that the national law that we thought was fairly well documented is also open to the interpretation of, in the US, the Supreme Court, and over here, various other legal bodies. In your world as a lawyer, given that it feels like the things that we thought were written in stone are actually just basically traced on the sand and the tide has swept over them, how would we begin to establish the moral and ethical boundaries that could take us forward into a world where the human and more than human world have once again got space to flourish? Does that make sense as a question?
Oh, totally. Yeah, I think, well, I think first of all, most people are coming to the reckoning or the understanding that something's got to give, right? And a lot of us are working incredibly hard to try and figure out what comes next. And I think if you're asking me personally, I'm fairly convinced by theories that contain aspects of care, justice, and fairness. And I think if we were to be able to wipe the slate clean, and really start again with our structures, our constitutional structures, our governing structures, our power sharing structures, what would we do is probably the question of our time.
Yeah.
I think I'm quite persuaded by John Rawls' theory of justice. And I
Tell me
think
more.
I've done some thinking around that. And I think that we could, in fact, quite quickly adapt that to start to think about governing with nature and governing with the natural aspects of the natural world. So, I don't know if you know much about John Rawls'
No,
theory of
please
justice,
tell
but
us, because I don't, and I don't think the audience will do either.
so, summing up someone's life's work in a minute or
Yeah,
two,
in a
the
sentence would be
pressure.
fine.
Yeah,
Yes, go for
ideal.
it.
Yeah, of course. Here we go. So, John Rawls' easiest way to explain this is if we had an island and we took 100 people there, and we said to them all, we're going to create a power sharing constitutional structure to make this island work for everybody. And when I say everybody, I don't just mean the humans, I mean the more than human, the water systems, the air systems, everything. And he says the best thing you could do is tell all 100 people that they will never know what position they will get. So they will design all those positions. Maybe they'll even design a king or a queen. They'll design administrative positions. They'll design probably a police force. But they'll never know for sure what position they're going to get. And we call that the veil of innocence, or Rawls calls that the veil of innocence. And it creates a system on our island whereby you cannot help but engage with justice, fairness, and equality, because you could at any moment become an earthworm. You could at any moment become a refugee. You could become a queen. You could become a butterfly. You could be living under the water system. You could be living in the mountains. You could be living by the beach, right? So um, you could be holding huge amounts of power for 3 months and then have that taken away from you under the structures that we design because your time has come to an end and you now are moved into a different part of society. So he says, once you ask that of a group of people, you genuinely get engagement with equality, fairness, justice, and you get what is termed distributive justice rather than retribution and retributive justice. And I think for me, that's where some of the gold lies. So we spend, as lawyers particularly, but society spends a huge amount of time on retribution. So,
That has been demonstrated not to work.
Right, exactly. So, we spend a huge amount of time going, this awful thing's gone wrong. There's this wrinkle in society, whether it's environmental crime or, whether it's human on human crime, human on animal crime, fraud. And we say, we don't like it. We say, oh, this awful thing happens. Right, let's punish all of those involved.
Yeah, as long as they weren't particularly rich, in which case we just let them off or ignore it or hide the files forever.
Yeah, don't get me wrong. That kind of justice is so flawed in so many ways, and I wouldn't sit here and pretend anything else. But when you engage with retribution, it's really just one version of justice. And I think the going back to the stories we tell ourselves, the fictions and actual fiction. People drafting all the time books on crime, true crime, fictional crime. All of that is a focus on retribution, and finding the perpetrator and punishing the perpetrator and holding them to account. And I think one of the things we need to do with our systems is really start to think much more about distributive justice from the very beginning, distributive fairness and equality from the very beginning. Um, I think that if we did that and we genuinely started to have a sensible conversation about equality and fairness for all, including the more than human and all ecosystems, and we engage with the veil of innocence, that could be such an interesting proposition, right?
Yes, totally. Has anybody done this?
Well, lots of people have written about John Rawls' theory of justice. I don't know, off the top of my head, I don't know if anybody has started to engage with it from a rights of nature perspective.
Or
It's
even a
quite
human perspective.
Yeah, loads of people have written about it from a human on human
actually
perspective.
implemented it. I'm thinking, has Iceland or a small
Yeah,
Nordic country
yeah, for
ever
sure.
actually done this?
It's it's a really well documented theory of justice, and certainly good politicians have engaged with aspects of it. And I think that's fine. I'm a firm believer that you don't need to haul absolutely everything in and do absolutely everything that it says. But um, the fact remains is that the large powers, particularly of the West, haven't engaged with it at all, really.
Well, it would be antithetical to the way that they currently run. I'm thinking that the Mondragon cooperative in Spain did something very similar in that people were randomly moved through within the businesses. They were randomly moved between the businesses, and from managerial positions down to the shop floor, you would have a managerial position for maybe a year, and then you'd be back
That's
to something
exactly
else.
it.
And
Yeah,
it worked.
yeah.
It
And you
worked
just
really
never
well.
know. So you have to
Exactly.
behave as if at any moment you could be changed around.
Yes.
And we're not saying necessarily that those positions are better or worse. It's just that you're in a different part of society, right? So
Yeah.
you have to engage with rules that would allow the vast majority of people to be treated fairly at most of the time. We could spend all day on Rawls' theory of justice. I think it probably needs to be tempered a little bit by an ethic of care.
Right. So
And
talk
I
to me a little
think,
bit about that. How would that work?
well, so my current existential crisis over breakfast, much to my child's dismay, is what on earth are humans on the planet for? Because I think the more time you spend in nature, the more time you spend with animals, with beetles and bugs, and with moss and slime and trees. You think, what are we here for? What exactly we do as a species compared to all these other fantastical creatures that exist around us. So this is my current existential crisis, and the only way I'm solving it right now is with the concept of care. And I think that our society, I think part of the great remembering, or some people have said to me it's the great re-remembering, because actually, we do know this stuff, and we know it in recent times. It's just we're choosing to ignore it. Is part of that is really understanding what it means to care, and really understanding what an ethic of care means. And I think care is different than being an ethical being, right? So, and it's different than empathy. That's really important. So, empathy is when you tell me something and I say, that's so tricky. I'm so sorry. That sounds awful. I've experienced something similar in my life, or I haven't, but I can relate in some way. That's empathy, right? Caring is actually coming and saying, what do you need to be okay? And how can I be in service to that? So, we'll all have those people in our lives where you'll pick up the phone and you'll tell them something and they'll go, that's awful. Good luck. And you think, okay, so they empathized, and then they went straight back to doing their thing, and that has to be fine. And then you'll tell someone else, and you'll probably have a picture of this person in your mind right now, and they'll go, okay, I hear you.
I'm getting in the
What do
car.
you
I'm coming
what
over.
do
Whatever
you
you need.
Yeah,
I'll
or
bring it.
maybe that's not what you need, but
Whatever.
they
Yes.
they are in service. They are in service to your best interests. As long as, all as long as they're not kind of putting themselves in massive danger or breaking their own internal boundaries or whatever. But those people will say, how can I help you to feel okay? How can I be in service to your care needs? And I just think maybe that's it. Maybe that's why we're here as humans, and I is to be caretakers. And I think it's linked to guardianship. I think it is linked to empathy, but I think it is something distinct. And I think that when you spend time with nature, and you first of all you start to notice nature, and you start to pick up on what nature needs from you as either as a species or as an individual. And then you really start to try and provide that care. That is just the joy of life. I mean, it just, there is nothing that you can sell me in a shop that makes me happy in the way that caring and being in nature and noticing nature and
And offering
thinking
oneself
about.
in service to the web of life.
Exactly.
But then we
And I
have to
think,
ask. Sorry, go on.
no, go on, you go, Flo.
Well, I think so. I've said it so often on the podcast that, as far as I'm concerned, what humanity is here for is to become self-conscious nodes in the web of life, which means we are constantly asking, what do you want of me, of the entire hyper-complex web, and responding to the answers in real time. It's everything that we teach in Dreaming Awake and in the Accidental Gods membership. But the key, the stumbling block, it's not a stumbling block, the runes that open the gateway to this for me are helping people to find the ability to ask that question and hear the answers in ways that are not projections of wounded parts of ourselves, otherwise known as our egos, or our hopes or our fears, or whatever we choose to call it. How do we, in our culture where we are so fragmented internally, where we have so many parts that are ready to step up and go, it's okay, I've got the answer to this. How do we get that inner flow and flexibility and resilience to actually ask of the web, what do you want? And hear the answers? Because even between people, that's hard. Because what you think you need and what you actually need may not be the same thing. And your capacity to ask for what you need, even if you know what it is, may be compromised. And my capacity to hear what you're saying in a way that lands, and my capacity then to fulfill your need. All of these things, there's a lot of very, very complex communication stories and pits into which they may fall. And so for me, my life's question is, how do we, in time and at scale, help a critical mass of people to be able to ask that question and hear the actual answer as opposed to what they would like the answer to be or are afraid the answer might be? And I wonder, how you approach finding that authenticity?
That's such an important question. I think for me, in my life, I think there is nothing more important than a curiosity mindset. I think that when you're curious about a person's inner world, you don't superimpose your view on them. You say to them, what do you feel is in your best interest right now? Um, and when they do have the capacity to say that, this would work for me. You can then say, I can meet that need. I've got that. I can hold that. I can bring that to you. I can do that for you. And I think going to anything, whether it's a relationship or whether it's trying to be in service to nature, or whether it's being a politician and trying to, somehow rebuild after the fall of democracy, if you go with a curiosity mindset, a ca- coupled with an ethic of care, right? So, you can be curious, but also be quite mean and selfish and egotistical. That doesn't really work for me. I think you have to go with curiosity, but also this really strong ethic of care and an understanding of relational responsibility within the network that you find yourself in. Um, I also think that you have to have quite high levels of forgiveness in your, woven into all of that. Because again, I think maybe forgiveness isn't the word, maybe it's grace. I think the word is grace, actually. I think forgiveness has probably got too much religious overtone to it.
It
But
doesn't have to have, I think, or we
yeah,
could
sure.
strip it of those.
I think
But what does
this is
grace,
me
how
as a
does,
recovering Catholic girl. So
okay, so how does grace differ from, can you unpick grace and
I
unpick
can,
forgiveness
yeah.
and let us know the difference between them?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's happened in the last 100 years or so, in my view, is that we have lost a lot of grace in society. And I think it comes back to what you were saying right at the beginning, where you were talking about the mask having slipped. They haven't even got the good grace to keep the bloody mask on, right?
Sure.
At least pretend to me. um, so I think that we are in a position where some humans are behaving in a way that is very graceless. And I wonder what it would look like if we prioritize recruiting politicians that demonstrate strong care ethics, really high levels of grace, and a concept of responsibility which is widened way beyond, the current moral understanding of responsibility. Um, I wonder what our political systems would look like if those were the personality questionnaires that we were putting out, if those were the conversations we were having and saying, look, do you have a sense of care within you? Do you have an ethic of care
Yes.
guiding you?
Yes.
Do you have a
Because this is
curiosity
not how we pick
mindset?
our politicians.
No, no, right.
They're basically picked on
We
their capacity to navigate
of
a corrupt
course,
system. I mean, look at
yeah,
what's happened over the weekend in the UK. There's a
yeah,
by-election. Andy Burnham wanted to stand for Labour. The Labour hierarchy will not let him stand because his next act would be to challenge Keir Starmer for the leadership, and he'd probably win because he would be a better leader. So they're not even going to let him stand as a Labour candidate. I
yeah,
don't know if he's going to
yeah.
stand as an independent, but we don't. Isabel Hardman wrote a long time ago a book called Why We Get the Wrong Politicians, which absolutely blew all my fuses because I thought I knew how bad it was. And I had no idea how corrupt the system was. But then someone like Zach Polanski in the UK or Zoran Mandani in the US turns up and they're authentic and they have care and they listen to people. Zach, I was listening to his podcast last week and somebody wrote to him and said, I'm a paramedic. Would you like to come and do a shift with us? And his first answer was, yes, of course. And would you like to come on my podcast and let's talk about this? And
Mhm.
that's not how our politicians work. So
No, I think
part
it's
of the
worse than
core, I
that as
think, is
well.
how do we get power to those with wisdom? And how do we establish what wisdom is, which is for you, part of wisdom would be to have this ineffable concept of grace, which I guess is human decency and the capacity to be compassionate, to have care, to not just end up with that kind of sympathetic, oh God, you're in pain, that's not good, but actually let me do something about this. How would you find the people who have the wisdom to whom we could entrust a measure of power?
I, I mean, I think almost by answering that question, I'm almost putting myself in a position of power. So I think, I have to say that the person deciding how to find something
Right.
is
The
also,
gatekeepers.
yeah, of course, right. So,
Right.
I'm hesitating because I think that if you're truly living with the ethics that I've just talked through, you wouldn't ever say, I know how to do that. I know exactly what to do there. So that's why I'm
It
hesitating.
may be a collective thing. I'm thinking in
I
indigenous
think it's a
cultures,
collective thing. Yeah,
elders
I
are,
think,
are recognized and honored as elders by the collective because they have the wisdom and it's self-evident to the group.
yeah,
But we don't
absolutely.
have the elders, and we don't
So I
have,
think we
at the
do
moment,
have the
coherence of
elders.
group.
I think we do have the elders. I think we absolutely have the elders. I think what we have is a society that hides the elders from us.
Okay.
I absolutely adore spending time with older people. I love it. Second to that is spending time with 10-year-olds is the next best thing. But older people are so going back to the grace thing, and the curiosity mindset point is we have lost so much by marginalizing our elders.
Right.
Um, we minimize them, we minimize their contribution, we constrain them. I mean, we really constrain them.
Sure.
We
Yeah.
we
Yeah. We
talk
lock them
about,
in spaces we don't have to go and
right,
pretend they're
and
not there.
and exactly.
Yeah.
But even having a retirement age, and I'm being super careful here because I know the vast majority of people want to retire at some point, but
Unless they're the president of the US, in which case
yeah,
they're way past retirement age and it doesn't matter. I mean, that is a thing, is we make people retire except judges and politicians. And then we seem to think that just because they're old, they should be there. And that also is not necessarily true.
true. I think that what we do with elders is so terrible. I think that we do a thing. There's a precursor to this point I want to make. I think we do a thing in our society now where we don't really have a strong ability to understand who we can learn from and
Mm.
and who we teach, right?
Yes.
So part of that is the fault of social media, which, for all its ills, does have some benefit. But with social media, there is no editing. So it's an onslaught of information all the time with no editing, right? So we've lost the ability of discernment between people that can genuinely teach us something, genuinely help us, guide us. The people that hold the institutional knowledge, the people that are holding the standard operating procedure manuals, right, for adult life. Um, we've kind of lost those in the melee of slop that comes out into the world. And I think one of the things we can do is we can really start to understand how elders would fit into a new story in a really meaningful way for them. Obviously, it's got to be consensual. We can't just drag them out into the streets and say, "Tell us everything. We're really lost." Um, it's got to be consensual, but there are plenty of older people that I spend time with who are just glorious, and almost everything that comes out of their mouth, you're just going, "Oh my God, thank you. This is exactly what I needed to hear." And it's really helping me, and I'm really learning something from you. That was kind of a ramble, sorry.
No, and it's really interesting. So let me unpick this, because I would really like to go into this because I live in a slightly different world. Let me think about this. So in my world, which I recognize is not your world, but a world the podcast is familiar with, our culture is what we call the trauma culture as opposed to the initiation culture. And this is Francis Weller's distinction that we don't need to go into, but the trauma culture is at least 12,000 years old because we can't have our form of agriculture if we don't believe ourselves to be separate from the web of life. So we're carrying the trauma of that separation down the lines for at least 12,000 years. And on top of that, Bill Plotkin, who is someone for whom I have a lot of respect, who's done a lot of work with Indigenous peoples in North America and elsewhere, says that our culture, from the Indigenous viewpoint, is locked in early adolescence. We can get to be 110, but we don't actually become elders, because elders, for him, We go through childhood, adolescence, adulthood, elderhood. And between early and late adolescence, each of these is split into. Between early and late adolescence, we go through an initiation process in which we discover what we're for. And then adulthood is enacting that forness out into the world and helping others find and teaching that, spreading what it is that we're for. So perhaps being a lawyer for nature and spreading empathy and care in the legal system. And then elderhood is helping to hold the space for the adolescents so that you recognize when someone is moving to that place of needing to go out and go through the initiatory cycle, and that we lack adults and elders. We could get to 110 and we're basically still, that our culture does not allow us to evolve. Added to which, I have not met many elders, and I have some old friends that I revere and love, but they don't have the emotional tools to do the work that I think we need to do. And it isn't to say they aren't amazing people, but I would not want them running the country, frankly, because they would run it as if we were Victorians, and Victorian times might have been okay for a certain class in the UK, but we were inflicting a lot of damage around the world. And so I hear you, absolutely. And I think I am also remembering a friend who used to work with a number of tribes in Africa who said one of the key things that she noticed was if a child died, it was sad, but, children die and you know how to make another one. If an old person died, everybody went into mourning for a year because you'd lost all that wisdom. And that we don't care if old people die. In fact, often we just breathe a sigh of relief and carry on. And the problem is the logistics of managing all the stuff they left behind. We have such a broken culture that we don't honor childhood and we don't honor elderhood, and actually adulthood is just basically you're here to pay bills until you die. So we don't really honor that either. We don't honor ourselves as alive because we're caught in the egregore, in the death cult of predatory capitalism, where we're all just little cogs in the greater machine. And so in our efforts, I'm thinking what we're beginning to unpick, and this is not going anywhere where I thought it would. We need a set of stories for our emerging new culture, which honors all aspects of life, from infancy to absolute elderhood, and allows each of them to flourish in the best way that they possibly can. And we need enough stories of right behavior to allow that to happen for the humans and the more than humans. So we need an absolute foundation that every single thing within the web of life has an absolute right to a flourishing life and an honourable death. And that with that as our foundation, we could perhaps begin to build the story structures of a moral and ethical system that allowed these things, that was predicated on those. And then I'm already going off into, then we wouldn't need a retribution-based legal system because it just doesn't work. We would need this system is not allowing these people to flourish. How do we help them flourish? A care-based system. First of all, how does that look? And second, how could we craft a system within the old system such that it could replace the old system? I realize this is the existential question of our time, but you have about 20 minutes to do it. Over to you.
No pressure. Well, first of all, thanks for that. I mean, yeah, I feel like you are one of the people that I feel like I can learn from. So it's just such a privilege to listen to you talk for a while about this stuff. And I think, just to clarify, I agree that eldership can come with wrinkles and grey hair and, feeling not quite as sprightly as we once were. But it is also a mindset, and you can sometimes find a 30-year-old who already has an elder mindset, right?
Yeah.
I think
Spoke
it's
to one
just
last week on the podcast. Exactly that.
I think that it is just that statistically it is more likely that a person who is physically older will have more eldership stuff going on. So I think that's just a statistical thing that we can respect. But of course, there are definitely people out there who are older than us, but not in any way behaving like an elder. Yeah, exactly. So I just want to clarify that. And I think that comes back to my point is we've lost the ability to recognize who we need to learn from, because there's just so much coming at us all the time. And so I think if one skill we should be developing with children is discernment and critical thinking. So I think, those two can be two sides of the same coin. And I think that, the kind of stuff that goes on with kids in terms of internet safety could be bolstered massively by teaching them discernment and editing. So I think we, sadly, and it's just a blimmin' lot of effort, but we have to all become editors in our own lives. We don't have the structure in place anymore for things to be edited for us, which obviously could be good in some ways because you get completely unfiltered stuff just coming at you all all the time.
Because
But,
again, whoever does the editing has the power.
yeah,
And
exactly,
up to,
exactly,
in our childhood, it was the BBC.
exactly.
And now that I know some of the editing that they've done in the past, it was not. It
Right?
was not in service to the greater
Mhm.
good. So,
Um,
yeah.
I think we're talking about really, really high level concepts here. So I just kind of want to bring it back to some kind of sort of concrete example. It is the case that you have the ability to curate your own social media feeds, right? You can fill your social media feeds with the most glorious poetry, with pictures of the most glorious things on earth: dogs, plants, fungi,
Yes. Yes.
moss,
Landscapes. Yes.
landscapes. You can fill it with people that are the helpers. You can fill it with people that are the elders. You have that choice. It's completely your choice now, and that is one of the democratization.
Yeah.
The
But your
the
limbic
democratization
system
of social media.
responds
Right?
to the
Yeah,
outrage.
absolutely. I
And
mean,
it's your
it's
conscious
addiction.
mind might think it
Yeah,
wants beautiful pictures of baskets of kittens, but your limbic
yeah.
system is alert
Oh,
and
absolutely.
feeds on the dopamine drips
And
of
what I would
that.
say, it's like any addiction, you have to find the quiet moments when you're not performing addictive behaviors, and you have to say, okay, I'm not on my phone. I'm going to write down on a piece of paper with an old fashioned pencil and paper the things that I'm going to do next time I go on Instagram or whatever. I mean, we've
Right.
gone into a proper side
But
tangent thing here,
this is
but
useful.
it's a
Yeah.
concrete example. And I think, I think by not doing that, we are blowing around like plastic bags in a storm, and untethered human beings who who aren't really actively managing their own environment, whether that's social media or workplace or relationships or whatever. And I think those kind of human beings, coupled with arrogance and stupidity, when they get into positions of power, that's the disaster, right?
Mm. Yeah.
They just blow like a plastic bag from one virtuous thing to the next that they
Yeah.
think needs to be said. And so I think the untethered human, without editing, is probably one of the worst things we can do in our current society. So just bringing it back to law, I think that it's important for me personally to remember that I am a Western lawyer, and that's my specialism. That's the blood that runs through my veins. And I will have been influenced so hugely by Western legal tradition. And I think when we talk about morals and ethics and creating new stories, I think, and I talked earlier about having this much wider concept of responsibility, for example. You have to, I think, if you asked me about how we design this new system, I think the first thing we have to do is understand what we don't know, what we've not ever experienced, what is just so far beyond the realms of our possibilities and our mindsets. And and I think, again, this is where a level of curiosity mindset comes in. It's where a level of um understanding and care ethics come in, because if you are excluding certain things from your design, then you have to really be sure that you understand that A, you're excluding them, and B, why you're excluding them. And so I think this is a very roundabout sort of way of coming back to our work at Lawyers for Nature, the very very circular route. We've done a few motorways and a few side roads on the way there. But I think for us, when we look at our work and I look at my work, I genuinely believe that a rights of nature approach has the ability to become part of a new design for a new way of being in the world. I think that I don't think it's flawless. I don't think it's perfect. I think there's a huge amount that can be criticized about the concept of nature having rights. But for me, when we think about it, we think that at its very obvious, what we're doing now doesn't work. So when we think about environmental law, it is retributive. It's retribution, right? It's saying it's, polluter pays, for
Right.
example,
But
is
or
very
doesn't, you can
or
dump as much
doesn't,
sewage as
yeah.
you
I
like in
mean,
the river, and we'll tell you that that wasn't very
right,
clever, and then do nothing about it.
and go, oops, that
Yeah.
that sucks. So I think, the vast majority of environmental law is written by incredibly clever people, and they're doing their best. I'm not here to criticize those lawyers. I think there's some of the most wonderful people have written legislation over the years. But the fact remains is it doesn't really work.
Mm.
And we really need to start asking the honest question of why doesn't it work? And I would even go as far as to say, there are other campaigns or other movements out there, for example, Ecocide. And again, Polly Higgins, Jojo Mehta, they are the most glorious women. And I have so much respect for them. But I personally can't put my life's work behind something that is end of the road, which is retribution and punishment, without really starting to think about what comes first. Because when you think about ecocide and you're saying, hey, you destroyed an entire ecosystem, we're gonna put you in prison, we're gonna fine you, the ecosystem is still dead.
Exactly. You have to catch that upstream of
Right?
so that you don't
Yeah,
destroy the entire ecosystem first. Yes, we're heading that way with the
exactly.
oceans, and we're going to regret it if we don't turn
And the
away
coral
from planet.
reefs and the
Yeah.
Arctic, and even just heritage ancient forestry. I mean, once it's gone, it takes 1,000 years for that forest to come
Yeah.
back. I mean, depending on your definition of an ancient forest, right? But even just even just thinking about bacterial cultures and their adaptation and the destruction of those sorts of things. Even our own individual gut bacteria, we murder it every day with. I
Yes,
mean, you and I
because we
probably don't,
don't
but
know about it. Yes,
yeah,
absolutely. We
it's
spray glyphosate in the land because somebody told us it was
exactly,
safe for people, and nobody asked, what else is it killing?
yeah.
Yeah.
So I think for me, a rights of nature, um, a constitutional rights of nature, whether it be through legislation, through case law, through what we do, which is largely transactional law. It's behaving as if nature has rights and working through society with willing victims who are prepared to come to us and say, let's do this thing and see what happens. Um, I think it does have a huge amount of power. It won't save the world on its own, but it is an upstream methodology. It's right at the
Right.
start.
Yeah.
It's something that comes at the beginning of all the stuff. And it's something that if we could find a way to create systems where nature has rights, I think it could be really, really interesting. And I think it could really help. Um, and I think as well, just to clarify, when we talk about rights of nature, it's a really nebulous concept. I mean, even my colleagues don't all agree on what rights
Oh,
of
really?
nature is. Well, yeah, I mean, there's huge disagreement in the field.
That's
All
another
really,
rabbit
really
hole. But
amicable.
could we
Huge
could
rabbit
we just
hole.
look at what the spectrum is
Yeah, of
very
course. So
briefly,
I mean,
because that feels important.
at its most simple, rights of nature would say that in order to be healthy under under law, in order to be well, in order to have justice and fairness under law, you need to be a subject of law, not an object of law. And so as people, we talk about legal personhood,
Right.
and we say that, the minute a child takes its very first breath, it's a real life human being separate to its mother, and it'll have the right to life, for example. And it'll have a qualified personhood status. So it won't be able to sign a contract, but
Right.
it is entitled to be resuscitated, for example, that kind of
Right.
thing, right? So there's
Right.
an element of intervention that we're prepared to have it to have a guardian stand up on its behalf and say, it's taken its first breath, it is now alive, it's got a
And I, the
sentience.
guardian, am going to speak for it
And
because it
I, the
does not
guardian, am going to
yet have the
say,
executive
yeah,
function to speak
exactly.
on its own behalf.
And then at some point in an arbitrary way, usually at 18, we say, you now have this whole new bag of legal rights. So, you know, you can vote in an election, you can smoke, you can drink, you can get married, you know, all of these things, right? So, so personhood often is a precursor to rights. That's how law works. And so we know this really, really well because humans have an incredibly checkered history of exclusion and complete refusal to award personhood to huge swathes of society,
certain groups
right?
of people. Yes.
Exactly. So, I
And
mean,
we're
we don't
seeing
even
that
need
being rolled back in
to...
the US in real time, or
Exactly.
in Gaza.
Exactly.
You know,
So,
you
I
draw
mean,
a
it's
line
the
in the sand, and
playbook.
people that side have personhood, and people the other side just don't have it.
Yeah. It's the exact thing that happens time and time again. When you have unchecked power, the first thing you do is you strip people of their legal personhood. Essentially, you marginalize them, you dehumanize them. You use terrorism legislation to say, if you become a terrorist under this definition, you will lose these rights: the right to a fair trial, the right to an open trial in public, the right to representation, the right to certain defenses, the right to certain sentencing rules. Okay, so we twist personhood really quickly when we have unchecked power. And so, and that's awful for humans. But with nature, for example, nature is an object under law. So it's a resource to be used by humans, right? It is never, certainly in the Western legal tradition that you and I find ourselves in, nature has never been seen as a subject of law. You know, and by legal history, I'm talking 800 years or so. You know, we don't have a concept of nature as a subject of law within a what we would call
Even the
modern legal
Romans would
history.
not have called it that.
Yeah,
So,
no,
and
the
they had
Romans,
quite
to
an
some extent, the Romans had some cool stuff around commons rights, which was quite interesting. And so they, you know, they did in some ways have a bit more of an enlightened approach to the sharing of nature than we do now. Right now, in our legal tradition, it is a resource to be used by humans. It has no space within the legal system to advocate for itself.
Right.
And so therefore, when we talk about rights of nature, the first thing we have to do is we have to start to question whether we would like to begin to recognize nature as a subject.
Yeah.
And I say that, you know, slightly in slightly a satirical way, in that nature, of course, doesn't give a single crap whether we do or not. This would be for us, right? This would be for us to make us behave better, to make our world better. So that is step number one in any legal design. And I think we're sort of edging towards answering your question, which is how do we do this? And I think we've kind of talked around it a lot, but I think we diffuse power really accurately across a number of systems and a number of voices. And I think we start to bring in a concept of responsibility to human beings that is widened, so that it includes responsibility to recognize ecosystems, nature, parts of nature, river health. The example I often give is tap water. You know, tap water is fantastic. I mean, come off it, you know, just what, I don't know, 70 years ago or so, you could not turn a little tap and have clean water come out. I mean, we are brilliant. We have shipped tap water, and don't get me wrong, I know there's many
You know,
places
it's
in the
highly
world that
toxic and you don't actually want to drink it.
have tap water,
But
and
it's there.
even in the UK, I mean, you know, people I know live in Tunbridge Wells, and there's 4,000 people that haven't had water there for like 28 days or something. It's ridiculous.
Wow.
So none of it's perfect. But if we just think about the concept of tap water for a second, it's a really illustrative example where the humans in that system have demanded personhood. You know, we're real things. We live and breathe. We need water. We have this need. We have this basic need, and therefore that basic need becomes a basic right. so the right to clean drinking water. And then either the state or the private actors provide that need through, these technology. We're ignoring huge things that can go wrong with all of
Yes,
that.
absolutely. Let's not go into that, but yes.
But the tap water example is fascinating because once you start to engage with rights of nature and you start to think that other things in that system have subjecthood under that law, you realize that water has traveled so far to come out of that final tap. And in fact, everything that's gone before it doesn't have the right to clean water. And it is not until it comes out of your tap that you can say, oh, there's clean water and I have that right.
Yeah.
And so what's really interesting is when you start to think, okay, well, let's give the river subjecthood under law. Let's give the salmon their legal standing under law to say, hey, I live in this river and this water flows through it and through me, and I have to engage in all of these jobs every day. I have to go to work as the salmon every day. And it is incredibly polluted because of what you're doing upstream. And I have the right to have my home life healthy and
Yeah.
to flourish. And then we would have to really force ourselves to think really carefully and really consciously about our water systems. You wouldn't need to go to the retributive justice side of things. You could stay with the distributive justice side of things. You could stay with, the widening the pool of responsibility to include the salmon and the river and the reeds and the roots of trees and the fungi
And the beavers
and the beavers and
yes.
everything. And it's tap water is such an interesting example that we get to this point where we're like, well, as long as it comes out of my tap and as long as it's vaguely drinkable, I'm okay with that.
Right.
How have we ended up in such a space where we just don't care about anything that comes before?
Exactly. And that was my big question. I live in a world where no problem is solved from the mindset that created it. And while we live under the death cult of predatory capitalism, where profit drives everybody, or it drives the people at the top who then drive everybody beneath them, I don't see a way to give the river and the water, the whole water cycle, legal autonomy and subjecthood, while it is still a source of profit. Now, this is back to Daniel Schmachtenberger. While a dead whale is worth more than a live whale, there will be more dead whales than live whales. While a dead tree is worth more than a live tree, there will be an incentive to cut down the forest, and we need to go back and look at what are the incentive drivers, and the incentive drivers of the water industry in this country is that it's an industry. It's full of PFAs, polyperfluorated alkylated substances, which are known endocrine disruptors and carcinogens, but the people who make them have bigger lawyers than the people who drink it. And so we're drinking toxic water because it's in the rain. And so when we're back to how do we create a political governance system? How do we bring power to those with wisdom who would be able to go, you know what, it's more important that the entire water cycle is seen as being alive than it is that a few people get to be very, 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 very rich. And we're running out of time, but I'm really interested because you live at this interface where you're endeavoring to create a system where people would, I'm about to say words I can't say on the podcast, would care about the water system while they have, presumably, pressures to make a profit. And how do you navigate that? Because I would go into it and go, okay, no profit. Guys, just stop trying to make a profit and then we can talk about personhood of the river. But I have the privilege of not living in that system, and I can think ideas and go, well, we just need to get rid of predatory capitalism, but we are still in predatory capitalism. How do you do it?
So I absolutely think that is such a key question. So let me just unpick it. First of all, I don't ever believe that there is one answer to any of this big stuff. So, it's the classic, it takes a village. So you need the storytellers and the artists and the makers and the folk singers, and you need to find the people who are guided by an ethic of care, and you need to elevate them, and you need them in positions of power. I think if you're asking me for a really specific answer, one of the things we could do right here, right now, which would be quite simple actually. I'm not saying it's palatable, and I'm not saying the people that are currently drawing those profits would be happy with it. Is we could have a really honest conversation about the externalization of costs. So we are, as humans, I'll try and make this brief because I know we're running out of time, but I think we as humans have become incredibly brilliant at externalizing costs. So we have incredibly clever people who draw lines around what costs are in and what costs are out. And then we have more clever people who say, okay, so you made this much money and you had this many costs. The difference is your profit, and we'll tax you on that profit, right? And so that keeps the tax system going. And that is important. Tax is really important to society. But if we had a super honest conversation about what costs have been excluded and included, and then we looked at the excluded costs and said, actually, we need to bring those back onto the profit and loss account, into the income statements, into the balance sheets, wherever, I don't sit here and pretend to be an accountant at all. But we would bring those back in, because honestly, can you honestly find me a single person who would look at our water systems over the last 50 years and say, it is absolutely right that that amount of profit was made and that that amount of profit was paid out to those organizations, people, family trusts, whatever? I cannot find a single person, even the people that have taken
Except
that
the
profit
current government,
themselves. Well,
sadly.
I think, yeah, they've done some things. I mean, they've started again. They're, for me, I can't. They're at the wrong end. They're at the punishment end. They're at the retributive. I can. Sorry, start again. They're at the
Yes.
They're at the punishment end. They're at retribution stage, where they're saying, when you screw up, and it's not even if anymore. It's when you screw up, we're going to send you to prison.
But
and it
were you saying
just
that? I wait to see it happen.
right? Yeah, I
I
mean,
don't think it will.
let's see,
I-
and how long for, of course, and whether somebody else just, you cut off one head of the
Yeah, and there's another one.
the
Exactly.
monster, and another one just
Yes.
grows.
And
So
in the meantime, the ecosystems are dying, exactly as you said.
right. So I mean, so the practical solutions are there. They are absolutely there. You say, actually, we first of all have a very honest conversation about accepting our mistakes. We made a huge mistake with the water systems and the water companies in this country. Huge. It wasn't one person's fault, but we made mistake after mistake after mistake. And that has resulted in huge amount of money being taken from the public,
Sucked out of our
sucked out
economy
of the
and sent
public,
off elsewhere, yes.
and given to a select few organisations, whilst the infrastructure for all concerned, and I do mean all, I mean the more than human communities, the beavers and the fish and the rivers,
And all
beds
people,
and
everybody
reeds.
drinks water.
Yeah. Those things have degraded and degraded to a point now where we have millions of hours of raw sewage being flooded into our rivers on a daily basis. Some of that is, in fact, categorically criminal behaviour. We know that. Some of it is determined by a particular piece of legislation to be accidental. So we've made mistakes, and we need to say, okay, this is no longer okay for most of us, if not all of us, including the more than human communities. And we need to really seriously think about bringing back onto the balance sheet all of the costs that should have been there for the last 50 to 100 years. And when we do that, we see a huge deficit to nature. We see a huge bill, a huge debt of gratitude and time and energy owed to nature. And it would, in fact, of course, mean that the dividend payments collapse completely.
Yeah.
They probably collapse for around about 150 to 200 years, right? So we do that. That's number one. And the second one is we strip back all of the instruments that are used to obfuscate the truth.
Right.
So, debt instruments are used categorically. shell companies, webs of companies and debt instruments are used to obfuscate the truth. So we dig and dig and dig, and we say, okay, no more of these instruments in this particular sector. It does not work for us.
Or indeed at all, actually.
Yeah, or
if they're there, we need total transparency in our
yeah,
financial dealings. That would, I think that
yeah,
alone would transform things.
yeah. I mean, we could be here all week, couldn't we, if we get onto the banking system?
Yeah.
Although I have got a credible story about a
Go on then.
wonderful lady in Switzerland who she contacted Zurich Bank in Switzerland and said there's no dead wood in cities. Cities have such a deficit of dead wood, and dead wood is so important for beetles and
Right.
bacteria and everything. And
Right. Fungal colonies.
she convinced them to commission her to bring dead wood right outside the bank. And when she turned up with it, I think she said to me she had to get it craned in. She found this massive oak tree and she got it craned in. And apparently they came out and said, "What on earth are you doing?" And
And
she
she
said,
just
"Well,
put it outside a bank in the
put
middle
it
of
outside the
Switzerland where
bank."
everything is pristine.
And said, "We need dead
Wow.
wood." And she said, "You've got a choice." She said, you can pay the crane driver to take it away. Or she said, "Or you can dig in and change the pavement structure, turn it into a feature, and accept that cities need dead wood." And
Right.
so they
living
thank God they
soil
did the
underneath it.
latter. They did it and said, "All right, then let's run with it."
Wow.
And yeah, she's a very,
Crikey.
very interesting woman. She's doing quite a lot of work around rights for bees at the
Oh,
moment.
I think I need to
which
talk
I
to
think
her
is,
in the
yeah,
podcast.
maybe you do. Yeah, she is amazing. So yeah, I think getting off on a tangent there, but yeah, I think there's some stuff we can do really, really quickly with lawyers, accountants, scientists, bankers, and corporate restructuring. We could do almost immediately, which is right at the distributive justice end.
It sounds a lot like Christian Felber's Economy for the Common Good, where you change the tax system so that you reduce taxes on people who are doing good things and you increase taxes on people who are doing bad things. And your definition of good and bad is largely, is it serving the more than human world? He wrote that a decade ago. I'm not seeing it happen. Are you seeing people engaging with this in a way that might make it an actual thing? Because I think it's a brilliant idea. And I think the whole world is tightening into a kind of fetal hunch of terror. And when people get afraid, they are less likely to do things that serve other demographics than their own.
Oh, being fear-led is some of the, when humans are fear-led, it's some of the worst behaviors, isn't it? I mean, I think, again, one thing we could do quite quickly is find those shiny, bright people that just stride out into the world with bravery and courage. And again, I think it comes sort of full circle back to what we were talking about at the beginning. We've lost so much. There's so much focus on the risks and the fear and fear-driven people with massive egos. And we know the stories of the old times. We know the hero's tale. It's a classic literature piece, and we know what that is. And we recognize a hero when we see one. We recognize bravery. We recognize courage. We see it and we feel it straight away. And we just go, I know what that is. And actually, that's a good leader. It's an ethical leader. It's a leader who leads with grace and responsibility. And I think one of the things we can do is uplift those people as much as possible in the next, 10, 15, 20 years. And when we start doing that and we start funding those people and we start bringing those people into the spotlight, everybody just goes, "Oh, that's it. That." I couldn't find the words because we've lost so much language around that stuff. We don't sit around campfires anymore. We don't tell each other fairy tales anymore. So we've lost so much of the language around what genuinely heroic behavior looks like. Although, as a caveat, I would say I think Disney has ruined a lot for me. I think I was thinking about this at the weekend and just thinking about being what I like to call quietly romantic. And I think one of the things that people can do quite quickly is to cultivate an attitude of being quietly romantic. And I think that we're slightly ruined by Disney and those kinds of franchises where romanticism is these huge flourishing grand things where you just get rescued on horseback from a tower, right? And I think when you start to really think about nature, and your place in the world, I think being quietly romantic is one of the most activist things you can do, is to recreate and recultivate what you understand romanticism to be, away from the modern sense of it. And I think those things come from fairy tales, they come from folk songs, they come from genuinely noticing and experiencing joy of service to nature is quietly romantic to nature. It's being in relationship with it and being in service to it. So yeah, I think I try as much as I possibly can to really cultivate a quiet romanticism with nature.
Oh, that's gorgeous. I think we might have found our title. I think that might also, I mean, we could keep talking for hours, I think.
We
And I
could.
think we could come back and have another go sometime I'm booked into October, so, sometime in the back end of the year. But that was glorious. And quiet romanticism and grace, those two together, feel like if everybody worked on that, the world would be a different place. Gorgeous.
I think
Thank you.
so. Yeah. No, thank
Is there
you.
anything else that you wanted to say? Because the floor is
Oh,
yours.
thank you. I don't know really. Let me think. I mean, I've said a hell of a lot. Was there anything else I'd like to say? I think if there was anything I'd like to say, I think it's that there's a lot of pressure to do something. And I think in our world, you and I, we meet a lot of people that are very, very burnt out. And I think I always try when I'm talking to people and say, there is a lot of pressure to do something, but also anything is fine. Doing
Mm,
anything is fine. Going and just sitting with your feet in a river, or just being quietly romantic with nature for half a day is fine.
it's
Just do it.
huge. Yeah.
It's really important because it means you come back to your place of work or your relationship with your person or your dog and you are just better. You're
Yeah.
just healthier. So I think anything you can do to make yourself healthier
Yes.
is in service to nature.
Right. Yeah. And potentially life-changing. Bronte, that was wonderful. Thank you so much for coming on to the Accidental Girls podcast. I'm sure we will have another conversation sometime towards the back end of the year. Thank you.
Thank you.